Hey guys, so today I want to talk about verb tense in our writing. So just a reminder, verbs show us when something happens. They kind of help us tell time within the sentence. Now, verbs can be present tense, Johnny jumps for joy, jumps is present tense. They can be past tense, Johnny jumped for joy, he did it in the past, or future tense, Johnny will jump for joy, so he will do it in the future. All right, now we should hopefully know our verb tenses, but what I want us to work on now is keeping our verb tense consistent. That means that we shouldn't just randomly change tense within a sentence. Okay? Now, sometimes you have to, and it makes sense. So if I said, Sean reported, it's past tense, on hurricanes, which are, present tense, tropical storms that often strike, again present, the Atlantic coast. That makes sense because he reported this in the past, but hurricanes still exist. They didn't stop existing when he stopped reporting about them. Sorry about that. All right, so that's a situation where it makes sense, but most of the time, you want to stay as consistent with your verb tense as possible. Otherwise, it's really confusing to the reader. Okay, so for example, people predicted, it's past, the weather after they study its patterns. So that doesn't make sense. How can I predict it in the past if I'm just now studying it in the present? It's confusing. Same thing here. In the past, people tried to predict the weather. They used methods such as studying animal behavior and observing the heavens. So if I'm talking about how people tried to predict the weather in the past, then I don't think they're still using those methods in the present, especially since they involve studying animal behavior. Okay, so that just doesn't make sense. Same thing here. In the early 1600s, people invented tools that allow their users to record weather data. So same thing, why are these tools in the 1600s being used now to record weather data? It's confusing, okay? So you want to stay as consistent with your tense as possible. All right, so let's talk about verb tense in essays, okay? So as we write response literature essays, it's important to know that whenever you're talking about literary works, paintings, movies, any kind of artistic creation, you should talk about those things in the present tense because they still exist, okay? So we think of it as like an eternal present, okay? So even if the book was written 500 years ago, the events in the book still exist in the present day because you're reading it right now, okay? So when you write about writers or artists or books, you want to use the present tense. Sometimes it's called the literary present, okay? So basic rule, if you're discussing historical events, use the past. If you're discussing fictional events, use the present, okay? So when commenting on what a writer says, use the present tense. Example, Hinton writes from first-person point of view, focusing on Ponyboy as the narrator and the window into the lives of the Greasers. All right, so I didn't say she wrote from first-person point of view, I'm saying she writes. Even though she's dead, we still say she writes because I can read that writing right now in the present. All right, when describing an author's work, however, you want to use the past tense. So, for example, S.E. Hinton published The Outsiders in 1967. So I'm talking about things like publishing dates, things like that, like the date they finished the book. We want to talk about those in the past. All right, when you are writing about a certain historical event, use the past tense. So if I'm talking about the setting of The Outsiders, the 1960s were a time of great social upheaval within the civil rights movement and women's rights movement, both taking place at that time. All right, so I'm talking about historical events, so it's going to be past tense. Now, when discussing events in a book or story, always use the present tense. This is back to that literary present we talked about, unless there's a shift in the time frame within the world of the text. And I'll show you an example. Ponyboy runs to the corner and sees Dally in a standoff with the police. He watches as Dally raises a gun and points it at the police. Okay, so notice I'm saying all of this stuff in present tense, like it's currently happening because I could open The Outsiders right now and read it, okay? Ponyboy realizes that since Johnny died, Dally no longer wants to live. Now, died is past tense here, okay? But that's because at this moment I'm describing in The Outsiders, Johnny has already died. Okay, so if it's something that happened earlier in the book than the current moment you're describing, then you can use past tense. But generally, you always want to use present tense when you're talking about books or movies or any other kind of art. Okay, All right. So hopefully we can start working on this in our writing, making sure we keep consistent verb tense all the time, and making sure when we're doing response literature, we're using present tense when we're talking about the author's writing style or the events happening in the book.